We're here today to welcome Ed Smith, one of the earlier designers of gaming consoles in the US. So we're talking 1970s. Is that right, Ed?
That is correct.
Yeah. I'm not going to say too much because Ed can speak for himself, but thank you for giving this talk, Ed, and welcome to the Centre for Computing History, even if you're not actually here. Lovely to see you. Technology is wonderful.
Absolutely.
Okay. Over to you, Ed. Tell us your story.
Well, you know, it's funny how you preface that by saying things about the computer and the computer history and how things are going today. Back when I started, of course, it wasn't quite like that. You know, you had the early stages of the computer industry. And for a person like me, who grew up in a city called Brooklyn in New York City, and if folks are not aware of the type of environment Brooklyn was in the late 60s to early 70s, it was not an environment that I would say was conducive to being a well-educated person. In fact, there was a quote by Malcolm X, who said back in those days that if you grow up in a bad neighborhood, you end up going to bad schools. And in those bad schools, you have bad teachers. And if you have bad teachers, you get a bad education. And if you get a bad education, you get a bad job. And if you get a bad job, you will never leave the environment that you were born into. So that's the type of thing that when I was young really hit hard with me. Not just that, but the whole idea of living in an environment that I felt was very dangerous, first of all. In fact, it's similar to some of your London neighborhoods like Hackney, you know? I mean, it's that type of an environment, right? Where you have the crime, the drugs, all of the things that go on that, you know, make you want to think whether or not you want to go in one direction or another. And luckily for me, I chose the other direction. And what I did is I went to a magnet high school. Let me just take a quick step back. Before I went to high school, when I was young, to stay out of trouble, I was a pretty smart kid. So I would start repairing the appliances in the neighborhood. So I would fix a toaster here, a radio there, a TV every now and then. So I had some income coming in based on my work fixing neighborhood appliances. And because of that innate knowledge that I generated, I said, let me just take this to the next level. And I went to a high school that specialized in technical electronics. So that's really how I got my feet wet as far as technology was concerned. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that if anybody is watching this video and I talk about technology, you have to think about the way technology is evolving. And if you get into it at any time, once you're in there, you're thinking this is the greatest thing in the world, and you never want to leave that world. And that's the way I felt. I started out very young in technology, and once I got the bug, that bug would never leave me, right? So I wanted to make sure that if I'm going to be able to do something in the world of technology, I had to get educated. So I did go to Westinghouse High School, it was called, in Brooklyn. And after Westinghouse, I said, okay, what's the next step? And the next step, of course, was to take some courses in computer science. So I did that. So I took courses in computer science and marketing, by the way. I was a double major. I'm not bragging about it, but it just so happens that that happened at the time, and it was great that it did. But now here's some of the things that challenged me as a young kid, growing up in Brooklyn, learning technology at a young age, and then trying to move to that next level as far as employment was concerned. While I was in high school, in my senior year, just before I graduated, I had my first child. So think about a young man who is trying to move into a new world of technology, and all of a sudden now he's got to take care of this child. And by the way, in my environment in Brooklyn, the area that I grew up in, young men were having children all the time. And not only were they doing that, but they were not taking care of them. I wanted to make sure that I would take care of my child, my daughter, and I did everything I could to make that happen. Being gainfully employed was one of those, making sure that she was well taken care of and didn't have to worry about, what she was going to eat the next day. So while I was in school, I had to go at night because I had to work during the day. So it was a challenge for both me and my family, for me trying to come up into this world of technology that I love. Luckily, my wife got it. She understood it. We've been together for 54 years now. And that was the reason for me to keep moving on. I think if it were not for me having that child, I could have been distracted in many different ways. But having a kid gives you a lot of focus, I can tell you that. And maybe even not having the kid, you have that focus because you have something that you love. But that certainly did help. So anyway, I did go to Pace University. And while I was there at night, I took on a job, probably my second job, but the most significant job for me at the time. And what I did was I was responsible for configuring and modifying traffic control signals. And that may seem mundane to some folks, but if you're ever in a street and the light changes and you see the don't walk signs, and you see the cameras up on the lights, you see all of these things going on, there's a lot of intricacies involved in traffic control signals. Now, when I started, I was doing work on mechanical units, and then they went to solid state units. And then when I was around 21 years old, keep in mind, I started at this company when I was 19. So by the time I was 21 years old, a company by the name of Fairchild came into this company called Marvelite, where I worked. And Fairchild said, we have this new microprocessor chip technology that is perfect for traffic control signals. And the management bought into it because Fairchild probably gave them a great deal because they were just getting started. And once they bought into it, they needed to have people who could configure, test, and manage those traffic signals. And myself and another gentleman at Marvelite, we were the best they had out of about 15 technicians. They chose the two of us. Now, I'll stop right there and say, from a personal and professional point of view, I didn't think I was that good, but they told me things that I didn't even know about myself. So when your head's down doing the work and you're just getting things done and you're not realizing the amount of visualization that people have on you, it was astounding to me. And they just came out and said, you're one of the best. And I thought, that's great. I didn't know it, but thank you. And they sent myself and this other gentleman, his name was Channa Puyang from Taiwan, to a facility at Fairchild, and we studied microprocessor technology in 1975. Now, keep in mind, the microprocessor chip was only introduced 5 years earlier. So 5 years later, you have a young African-American who has studied microprocessor technology. Now, when they told me I was pretty good, I kept that into the back of my mind, and I did the work, got the knowledge, went back to Marvelite, started doing work on these microprocessor controlled traffic signals. Now, the environment at Marvelite was a manufacturing environment, right? So you had the shaded windows, the big brick buildings, and it was not an environment that I felt was, I don't know, it was not a place where you could wear a suit and tie to, let's put it that way. It was a lunchbox environment. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, but I felt, looking at things that I saw, I felt there was more for me. And by the way, I was always a reader. I went to the Brooklyn Public Library when I was 10, and I kept reading. So I read everything about anything. And once I got into technology, I read about technology as well. So I kind of knew what was going on in the industry, right? I followed it big time. There were a few magazines out at the time that I would read. Omni magazine was one that I remember, and I was just getting like really hyped up about the world of technology. And so I'm saying to myself, I have this knowledge that I've just been given around this great technology and microprocessors. How can I get something else? How can I get another job that benefits me more as an individual, gives me more satisfaction with my work? So I started looking around, and that was 1976 that I started looking around, and I found this company who gave me an interview. And by the way, when you do an interview as an engineer in these different companies, the three first jobs I got, the first one before Marvelite, and then this new company called APF Electronics. The interview was, here, build this or fix that, right? It wasn't, you know, what do you know? What have you do? We see your resume. None of that. If you know it, you know it. That's all there was to it, right? So I go into the APF, same thing. They told me to build something, and you know, I did it in record time, of course, because that's the kind of stuff that I love to do anyway. So they did hire me at APF. And they hired me primarily because of my knowledge, not just in the microprocessor space, but around the bus technology of the microprocessor, which is what traffic control signals use. The bus turns on the lights, turns off the lights, right? Changes signals. So that's why APF wanted me on the team. And once I got on the team, it was like first day there, I'm in a conference room and there's a whiteboard. Was it a whiteboard then or a blackboard? I think it was a blackboard. But anyway, we're putting up these schematics to build out this new video game. And by the way, APF Electronics back then had already been in the business of designing and delivering calculators. And then they also had one of the Pong games called TV Fun. You should be able to get your hands on that one, by the way. That's readily available. So TV Fun was the first game they did. And then they wanted to do the next level of that, which was color-based video gaming. And that's when we were heads down, working on the design of this new video game. And all of a sudden, I was a part of an engineering team of 4 people, 2 guys who were on the hardware side, and a gentleman and a lady who were on the software side. That was it, right? It's kind of like, I love the way I read about, you know, Jobs and Wozniak when they did the work on the Apple. Very similar, very similar. Small group of people just getting something done with no distractions. Management left us alone. We did what we wanted. They gave us all the resources we needed. So we go ahead and we build out the MP1000 video game, cartridge-based color video game. The MP1000 video game, if people have not heard of it or seen it, you can look it up. It's an 8-bit video game, color-based, 256 by 192, which is, you know, like these days, nothing, but that's where we started. And the game itself had 12 cartridges. Yeah, 12 gaming cartridges. And some of them were pretty good, by the way. I mean, you know, when you play them back then, they were just as good as the games you would play on the Atari. They were all 8-bit machines. You know, no one had anything magical going on at that time. The only difference was that people migrated to Atari more so than any other video game at that time. And that's mainly because Atari had already been very successful with the games in the arcades, right? So people knew of Atari. But back then, if you think about it in the video game space, and you know who these folks are, I mean, you had Coleco, you had Magnavox, you had a lot of companies who made video games who were also no longer around. So we were one of those companies that just didn't make it because of the competition that Atari presented. That being said, that didn't stop us from trying, and we did. We moved on, and we felt that from what we heard in the industry at that time, and I think it was from either Atari or Mattel. I'm pretty sure it was Atari, but one company said in an article that they were going to take their video game and adapt it to a personal computer. So they were going to turn their video game into a hybrid personal computer. So I'm thinking, wow, you know, we go back into the room and we hear about this and we sit down and we start talking and we're going, I think I was the one that actually said, I can build an adapter easily to connect those a video game to a console. I said, I know that because of the bus architecture. So I said, we can do this. And I drew something up on the blackboard. And they bought into it. And lo and behold, we have a console that was delivered. And if you, again, you can look this up. It's called the Imagination Machine now. So you had the video game that was laying on top of a computer console with a connector that connected the two units together that I designed. And now you had a full-fledged personal computer / video game. And the industry thought that was pretty cool. And what we tried to do at that time was to design a system that was not Atari, that was not the Trash 80, if folks remember that, TRS-80. These were computers that were trying to address a business need, if you will. Most of the early computers were being purchased for 3 reasons. They wanted to do word processing, they wanted to do spreadsheets, or they wanted a database. And those were primarily business people or writers or accountants who were buying computers in the early days. We wanted to build a computer for the family. And that's why we had the video game as a starting point. So we felt that the video game itself was a good entry into the personal computer field. Sounded pretty good. The analysts liked it. Unfortunately, the market wasn't ready to spend $699 in 1976 for a video game / personal computer. The home market was just not quite there. But, we did try and we moved on. We tried to do a second version of that where we just took the video game and we put it directly into the console. So it was hidden. And that was called the Imagination Machine 2. Right? So here's the way, here's the background to all of this that I just explained, right? If you think about this, you have this African American who now has designed this video game and a personal computer, and I was only 26 years old. Now, I had never been on a plane before, right? I had never spoken in front of a group of people before. I had never done a number of things that I ended up doing in my career that was pretty cool. But when I was first asked to get on a plane and go to Chicago and go see this company called Sears, who was the primary distributor of the APF products, their calculators and all that other stuff was distributed through Sears. And they said they wanted me to go there and talk about the video game design. And then how we were working on the next level of the Imagination Machine. So I'm actually at the Sears Tower. At the top of the Sears Tower, this is the tallest building in Chicago, I think, today, or maybe the second. And they have a dining area up on the Sears Tower, and I'm having this fabulous lunch. I'm looking out at the Lake Michigan, and the only thing I could think about at that time was, how the hell did I get here? Right? I mean, all of a sudden, it seemed like things just happened like that. You're doing this work, your head's down, you just want to get projects done. I could care less about going out and talking to anybody at that time, right? That was not my thing. My thing was building something and making it work and feeling good about it. That was my whole thing. So now all of a sudden I'm talking to folks and I realized I like talking to folks, right? So that was the first time it happened. So once we left Sears, I think it was like not long after that, they say, all right, Ed, Consumer Electronics Show, you're going. So now I'm flying to Vegas. This was like amazing to me as a young man, right? My wife thought I was cheating on her, I'm sure, because I'm just going all over the place anyway. But the whole idea of this young man having the opportunity at that time, right? At a time when the whole industry was just taking off, was amazing to me. It really was. When we did the Imagination Machine, right? We started marketing that. And again, the salespeople who worked for APF, these guys were selling calculators. They had no idea what a RAM was or what ROM was. They had nothing, they had no knowledge in that. And that's why they would ask me to go out and talk about these systems. So I would go to these different shows. One of the shows I went to was a show called the Boston Computer Society at the time. Of course, it was in Boston, Massachusetts. And people were all bringing their hardware to this event. You know, the folks from Radio Shack was there with their TRS-80. Coleco was there with ColecoVision. And of course, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak shows up, right? Now, again, I'm 26 years old. Jobs is the same age as me at the time, okay? So he's got his Apple there. And I go up to Jobs and I say, hi, my name is Ed Smith. And he just blew me off, right? Didn't want to talk to me at all. And I'm like, okay, I guess that's the way it is in this world, you know? But then I ran into Steve Wozniak, right? And I said, hi, my name is Ed. You know, I did this computer over here. And he looks over and he says, oh, that's cool. And he starts talking to me for like 10 minutes. I'm going, that's what I'm talking about. And I started asking him questions. And he gave me information about why he did what he did on the Apple, you know, open architecture, and why he wanted third parties to be able to build into it. And I absorbed all of that stuff in that 10-minute conversation that I had with Woz, right? And I'm going, this is great, you know? This is exactly what computers should be. Now, we didn't have that with the Imagination Machine. Our machine was closed, but it had a video game on top. But we were selling it to a different market. So I understood what Wozniak was getting to. And since I remembered that conversation so vividly, the Imagination Machine and the video game, the MP1000, in the mid-70s just was not selling. And the company started losing money. And all of a sudden, the market for the business went really, really down, and they had to lay people off. Now, I didn't get laid off because, again, you know, this was a company that was a great company for me to work for. The executives at that company, we had a wonderful relationship, and they knew they were losing money. And before they could even come to me and say, we have to let you go, they came to me and said, we're going to let you stay here for as long as you need to until you find another job. So I thought that was very cool, right? And luckily, the job I found was with Apple. Yeah, so now I'm still living in Brooklyn, right? You know, I go to work at APF day in and day out, and you have the conversations that you hear from the other folks, and they talk about mowing lawns and shoveling snow and, you know, taking their kids to vacation. And I'm thinking, I've never done any of that stuff, you know? And luckily, I got the job at Apple, and that job was in upstate New York, Albany to be exact. Albany is the capital of New York State, and they moved me and my family up to Albany. So that was a first opportunity for us to live the way I used to call it the beaver life. And the beaver life was from a show that I used to watch as a kid called Leave It to Beaver. Picket fence and, you know, the nice yard and everything, the family running around. So I was happy to end up having that life. And luckily, Apple was the company that gave it to me. And by the time I started working for Apple, Steve Jobs and I did have a chance to finally talk. And Woz was still Woz. I had a chance to meet with Woz on a number of occasions. And I went through the entire challenging stage that Apple went through. Because when I started with Apple, they only had the Apple II at that time. And they went to the Apple IIe. And then they went to the Apple IIc. So there was these different versions of the same Apple at the time. But then Apple took some risks, and you may know about this. They introduced the Apple III. So now I'm the territory man. I had the entire upstate territory. I would have responsibility for training all of the dealers in the Apple territory. And now I get this Apple III in front of me, and my first thought was, this is a piece of you know what, right? The operating system was terrible. And I'm thinking to myself, this is never going to sell. Before even the market said it. I was saying this to myself. And I actually went back to, I didn't go back to Wozniak, but we ended up talking when the machine was first introduced. And I said to him, I asked him, why this technology? Why did you move away from the architecture that was the Apple II? And he gave me the look like, you know what, man? Here was his look. It was like, I didn't want to do this. It was somebody else, right? And if you read about Woz's story, you'll find that right after the Apple III was released, Woz left the company. Wozniak told me back then, for that 10-minute first conversation we had, open architecture is the way to go, because you can have third parties who can build it up and do things that you never think of to make it a better machine. The Apple III had none of that, right? Now, right at that same time, of course, you had IBM coming into the market. And what did IBM do? And if folks are aware of this history, I apologize if I'm repeating something, but IBM just said, you know what, that Apple II that Apple did, that was pretty cool. We'll build a similar type of machine. We'll just change the operating system, but it will have slots so third parties can add additional functionality. The IBM PC takes off. Apple had that business with the Apple II. They killed it. So IBM became successful on the heels of the architecture that Apple originally designed. So that killed Apple's business for the next probably 10 years. So they went from the Apple II to the Apple III. Then they tried it again with the Lisa. This is when Steve Jobs had this epiphany after going to the Xerox labs and saw what they were doing with mouse technology and visualization. He said, I've got to do that. But what he didn't realize is you can't shove all of that technology into an architecture that can't accept it. The chipsets just were not there yet to do that. So the machine was slow. The drives could only hold like, I think it was 10 megabytes of storage at the time. It was just not quite there yet. So that died as well. So you had the Apple III that went down, and then the Lisa went down, and finally it came out with the Macintosh, which was again slow at the time, but eventually they got it right. But even with the Macintosh, Apple still was not doing that well. And it wasn't until they came out with one product that turned Apple around. It was not a personal computer. You want to guess what it was? No? Okay. Anybody on the call want to guess what it was? Anybody want to try? No? Did we get anybody? Okay, you can't Google this now. All right, I'll tell you. It was the iPod. So Apple came out with the music box that you could fit in your hand and just play songs and download music. That one product turned Apple's revenue around, turned their stock around, and then Apple from that point on started to become the company we all know today. After the iPod, it was the iPhone. And then from the iPhone to the iPad. But unfortunately, during that time, I was no longer with Apple, because by the time they killed the Apple II and screwed up with the Apple III and the Lisa, that's when I did get laid off, because they couldn't afford to keep people. So I had to move on. But that's my quick Apple story, and I'll stop there because I think I need to go back and talk more about what I did in my earlier days when I worked at APF. And I just wanted to share that with you because, you know, everyone always has their start, their middle, and their ending. So my start is really what the focus of my book called Imagine That is about. It's about my start in this industry of microprocessor technology and what the knowledge that I gained from learning microprocessor technology afforded me for the rest of my career, right? Because from that point of working for Apple, I moved on to work with some of the best companies in the industry, being this technical specialist, you know, this technologist, because of the knowledge that I gained early on. very few people had the knowledge that I had as I was going through the industry, and picking up on all of these different technologies that were coming out. And if you think about what happened after the introduction of the microprocessor chip, you had, once the PC was introduced, you had optical scanning was becoming a big thing, right? People wanted to scan their documents and everything. Lawyers loved that. And I would go out and talk to law firms all the time about that. So now I'm pushing that kind of technology. And then all of a sudden, networking technology comes out. I'm like, that's cool. So I finally get a job working for a company called Novell. If you haven't heard of Novell, they were the leader in computer networking. And this guys goes back before you had wireless stuff. Everything was tethered at the time, right? So you had these big computer networks, and Novell was the core to these computer networks. And I worked for Novell for 13 years as this technologist responsible for the integration of their product with third-party companies, right? Because if you have a network, your software has to be able to run within that network. You have network cards that need to be configured for that network. And I was responsible for working with those types of companies, with their engineering teams to deliver those types of solutions. And that's exactly what I did for the rest of my career. Just working with software firms, with hardware firms, when they're coming out with these new technologies. And their first question was, how do I integrate it? How do I make it work with third-party companies? How do I get this stuff to merge together when new structures are coming out, new APIs are coming out, all of these things are happening, data structures are coming out, right? So you have to integrate with the databases. And as you know, since you were a data analyst, the two top databases at the time was Oracle and Sybase, right? So you had to do a lot of work with those companies as well. That's where I just went through that entire gamut of going from that kid who was fixing a radio to this guy who's now talking to engineers, not just the engineers, but the heads of engineering, and sometimes the presidents of companies, to help them deliver their solutions. One of the top companies I worked with while I was with Novell for 8 of the 13 years I was there was IBM. I had full responsibility for that company. So I was with the IBM management team all the time. And after I left Novell, I still worked with executive management teams all the time, because they needed to know how to move technologies forward based on the structures and how they can integrate those structures with third-party products. It wasn't easy, right? So that's what I did for the rest of my career. But all this started with the work that I did at Marblite and then APF. That's where it all started. And it started because you had a kid who was bold enough, I like that word, bold enough to say, I'm not going to stay in that environment, that world that everybody else was not able to come out of, and get into this environment of microprocessor technology. And by the way, I'm not saying that people did not get out of that environment. Many people did, but they did not get out as a person who was experienced in microprocessor technology. And that's the difference that I had from that environment. So that's where I'll stop, and I'll wait for any questions.
Okay, does anybody have any questions that you want to pose to Ed? Let's not worry about we have. Okay, the first question's just popped in. I'll read it out to you. In comparison to your experience at Marblite with Fairchild, did you get much support from Motorola when designing the MPIM at APF?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, Motorola, and I'm pretty sure this person who asked the question knows that the video game was based on the Motorola 6800 microprocessor. We actually looked at 3 different chip manufacturers, and we chose Motorola because they were the cheapest. They were giving us a lot of stuff before we had to pay for it. And they gave us the development environment for free. It was called the Exerciser. So they gave us that environment for free. And they supported us all along the way. So absolutely, yes.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
Going right back to the beginning of your story, what was it that got you interested in fixing those appliances, the odd toaster, what led you in that direction in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, when I was a kid, I have 4 brothers and 2 sisters, right? So we had a big family. And, mom and dad did not have a lot of money. And whatever they did have, they tried to make it last as long as they could. So the first time I got involved in anything that had to do with electronics was when my mom's toaster broke, right? And my mom knew, I think even before I knew, that I was a smart kid. Because nobody goes around saying I'm a smart kid, So your parents will always tell you, this kid's smart, right? So she says, Eddie, see if you can fix that. That was the only thing she did, right? So I take the toaster into my bedroom, I play around with it and I go, oh, this thing is a filament. And I knew what that was. And there was a hardware store across the street. And I go over there and I get a filament, I put it back in, toaster worked. But before that toaster worked, by the way, I plugged that thing in one day and I got a shock for the first time. And when I got shocked, my first thought was, how did that happen? This is really where it started, right? It wasn't the fact that I fixed the toaster. It was the fact that I got shocked. So when I got shocked, I go down to the Brooklyn Public Library to look up the technology of electronics, right? Now, I was just maybe 10 years old at the time, but I just wanted to know, how do you get shocked? So then I started learning about 120 volts, AC current, and that stuff was cool to me. I thought, this is how it works, huh? So from that point on, I was never afraid to get shocked because I always knew how to not get shocked. So that was the start. But then when I read about this stuff, I read some things that Edison had done. I read about Tesla. So that was the start for me. It was the history of electronics.
Thank you. I have another question that's popped up in the chat. The tech is evolving at high speed. How do you keep up with innovation?
Oh, man. Yeah. So, I think when I was with Apple at the time, I could remember saying to myself, this tech space is pretty cool, right? And every time I said that, it was because something new came out, something innovative came out. And for the next year after year after year, I would say the same thing, because it seemed like every year something new came out, something more innovative came out. And the answer to the question is, how do you keep up with it? You stay in the industry, right? And the difference between what I've done and I guess what other people do in the industry is I was able to have the opportunity to work across all lines of technology, right? So I wasn't just I shouldn't say just, I wasn't a programmer. I wasn't a project manager. I wasn't a data analyst. I wasn't any of those things. I was all of those things because I had to know all of those things in order to move technology forward, right? So just like when I was talking about Novell and networking, when networking first was introduced, many companies were leery about investing in networking. And in fact, the CIOs of those companies would never approve networks. It was the business managers who were buying the networks, not the CIOs. They wanted to stick with their IBM mainframes. That's what they did. That's what they knew. Because even those guys were afraid of the new technology that was coming out. And that continued year over year over year, right? So even today, some CIOs are looking at AI and they're going, oh my God, right? I don't know what to do with this because they haven't been introduced to it. They don't understand the nuances of it, the advantages of it, and the disadvantages of it. And if you don't understand what AI does for you, yeah, it's going to be just like you were trying to do a network back in the earlier days. Because frankly, AI is nothing more than data that's being highly manipulated, highly analyzed and manipulated. It's all about this whole industry, by the way. It's all about data. forget about what anybody else tells you. You know, you can have hardware, and hardware does certain things, but hardware does nothing without data. So that's what this industry about. And so if you have the ability to be able to understand the way data is architected and how it's used around different products, including AI, including things like accounting systems, uh, workforce management solutions. I worked for Kronos for a while too, so that was a great one. But it's all about the data. And if you can be able to understand and not just manipulate the data, but integration again, because some data are not the same as other data, so you have to be able to know how to integrate data and use the right tools to do that. And there are companies who do that, and you have to know who they are. So all of that knowledge comes over time, but if you start early and you continue to read, you go to the conferences, right? You see what's going on, you get the visualization of what's happening in the industry, you kind of know what to see down the future. I remember talking about artificial intelligence 15 years ago, right? I was at a conference, I was doing a talk, and somebody brought up the word AI. And I think we were talking about something, but I said, if you think about, and this is what I tell a lot of folks, even when I do speeches today, if you think about what you see when you go to the theaters, and you've seen movies like I, Robot. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's a Will Smith movie. And then you had the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie with the, oh gosh, what's the name of that movie? Skynet was the name of the world that they were trying to avoid. Terminator. Thank you, Ed. So you had Terminator movies, right? So I told people, I said, if you look at those movies in the earlier days, and there were some even movies more so earlier than that, Star Trek, right? You put the button and you can talk to a computer, right? So now you can talk to Alexa. I tell people, if you just watch what people are doing in the movies, it will happen. It just will happen because they've already dreamed it. If you can dream it, it will happen. And one of the best books anyone should read goes back to 1950s, written by Isaac Asimov. If you can find them, read them, because he's the guy that started the robot series and the whole idea of artificial intelligence. So I don't know if I got off my train of thought there, but I just want to make sure people understood that, because it's all about the data and how technology moves forward with the data.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone? I'm going to ask another one then. This is a slightly cheeky question. I've never seen an MP1000.
Oh.
Can you, not in the flesh, I mean, obviously I've seen pictures. What is it like? What is it like to use? What was the experience of playing a game?
Yeah, I apologize because I actually have one sitting in my garage and I could have brought it over here to show you. But yeah, so the MP1000, very, very simply, is a console unit. Of course, it has two joysticks that are tethered to the console unit. The thing we did, and I did the joystick work, the thing we did on the joystick, and unfortunately we never got a chance to make that happen, was we put a keypad on the joystick. And we thought the keypad could be used for some calculations and some other things, but never got the software running to do that. But it had the joysticks, of course, and you would plug your cartridge into the console unit, and the console unit actually had a game built into it, so that you at least had something to play once you purchased the machine. So each cartridge probably costed about $30 at the time. And you would actually go ahead and play your games. And some of the games, just quickly, that I'll mention to you that we had on the console, we had our version of Space Invaders. We called ours Space Destroyers. One day I'm sitting home with the family during the holidays. And one of the things I got for my daughters, I had two kids by then. I saw it at Sears, of course, because I go to Sears a lot because that was where I, you know the story. But so I bought them a Rock'em Sock'em Robot. You ever hear that? Right? If you can look it up. So I go back to work and I say to the programmer who was writing the games, I said, I'm playing this Rock'em Sock'em game. That would make a great video game. And sure enough, she wrote the video game for it's called Robots. So that was another great game. And we had, of course, versions of, let's see, we had a backgammon game. We had a tic-tac-toe game. We had a Tetris game. We had some of the similar games that other companies had, but as I said, the market just wasn't there for the MP1000. But it was a very nice game, I can tell you that. And by the way, when I worked for APF, we would get returns on the video games. And one of the roles that I had was to figure out why these games were being returned. Was there anything that was consistent with the returns? So, I would do some checking, and once I figured out what the problem was, I would document it, repair the game, and put it into a closet. And then one day I'm putting the game back in the closet, and I look up at the board on the rack, and I'm going, man, there's a lot of games sitting here, right? And they're not being taken back to be repackaged or anything. They're just sitting there. So every once a week or so, every once or twice a week, I would go into the room, take about 2 or 3 games out, take them back into the neighborhood that I grew up in, and give them to the folks in the neighborhood so they can play the games. So I had people in the neighborhood, instead of messing around in the streets doing the wrong thing, they were sitting in their house playing video games. So I was happy to do that for them. You can't tell my bosses now because they don't care anymore, but but I did do that for them, and I thought that was a nice. I probably gave away 50 games. Yeah. And if I had to pay for them, I would have.
That's a great thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. So the first imagination machine had both BASIC and a monitor built in. Were those written by the software people from your team at APF?
Yeah, the BASIC interpreter was written by a gentleman by the name of Harry Cox. And Harry was the person who not just did the BASIC interpreter, but he also did all of the ROM technology. So all of the startup stuff, Harry did. The games themselves was built by a lady named Linda, and I can't remember her last name. But Harry was the engineer who was responsible for the game having the right startup sequences and adding that to the imagination machine. And by the way, there was no monitor built into any of that stuff. It was just an add-on. Yeah. In fact, the video game was plugged into your TV. And then when we had the imagination machine, that would be plugged into those old 9-inch monitors, if you remember those things, black and white 9-inch monitors. Yeah.
Any more questions, anybody? I'm going to ask another one then.
Okay.
You say that you were one of the earliest African American console developers or game developers. Were you conscious of that at the time? How did that feel? When you looked around, were there people like you? Presumably weren't. How did that feel?
Yeah, great question. Quite frankly, when I was working at APF and I was doing the work on the video game and the imagination machine, I never once thought about the color of my skin. It never occurred to me that I was a Black person doing this work. It was just Ed Smith doing the work, right? And in fact, after I left APF, that entire experience, I just moved away from it. I moved on from it. And if you're in an engineering, anyone who has done work in engineering, they understand this. You don't dwell on what you've done because there's always something else to do. So I did it. I felt good about it, and I said, okay, what's the next thing? So no, I never thought about being a Black person until, right? And there's always an until, years later, and I'm sitting around, and I think by then we were doing things like AOL or whatever the internet communication was at the time, but I started seeing these information screens popping up talking about APF. And I go, oh, that's the company I did the work for. And I started replying to some folks. And then all of a sudden I get this email from a gentleman out of the blue, who saw me, because I was still talking about APF from, to some companies and to some organizations, but not a lot. And I did one talk for a journal in New Jersey when I lived there, and that journal was published, and this guy found the journal. And then through that journal, he found me, and he started saying, you're the only African American who designed a video game. And I'm going, really? Right? I'm still not thinking about that. Really? So he goes, Ed, you have a history here. He says, you need to tell your story. That gentleman's name was Benj Edwards, and he's the reason why I'm here talking to you today, because I would never have done this or thought about doing this until Benj said, Ed, I need to publish your story. So Benj was a writer. He's a writer for Fast Company. So he took my whole story. We spent hours on the phone together. He lives in North Carolina. I was living in New Jersey. And he would ask me questions. And all of a sudden, everything that I had completely forgotten about just started coming right back to my mind. And he was getting all of the information out of me that I had put in the back of my mind for so many years. I felt so good just letting it out. So we got it out. He did the story. It got published. And all of a sudden, I started being asked to do interviews. And then after one of the interviews, somebody said, you need to write a book. And I go, oh, geez, I need to write a book? Okay, wow, this is great. So I did that. And I said, all right, once I've gotten the book out, now people need to know that the book is there. And now I want to make sure that people do know my story, because I understand this is the first day of Black History Month. So I'm proud to be able to say to folks out there, this is me, this is what I did. And by the way, so can you. That's definitely the story.
Thank you. Another question has popped in. I don't know if they're referring to now or in the past, but the question is how to get a job in software industry when there are 1,000 applications per job. The market is saturated with talent.
I like that. All right, so here we go, right? Now we're talking the earlier days, right? The early days of this whole thing. The first software company that I worked for at the time was Novell. So I was hardware all the time. I was hardware at APF, Marvelite, Apple, hardware, right? Novell was a software company that supported hardware technologies, right? You had to have networking hardware for the software to run. But that's not why I got the job. I was actually doing some, let me call it independent consulting at the time. And there was a conference that was being held. It's probably like 70, 80 people at the conference. And they wanted somebody to come in and just talk about the industry itself, networking being one of the things that was emerging in the industry. So I get up and I start talking about the different networking technologies, 3Com, IBM Token Ring, and Novell, and there was one or two others, Banyan. So I'm just giving folks the pluses and minuses of each one of those technologies. And all of a sudden, somebody comes up to me and says, you would be a great person to work at Novell. Just like that, it was the manager of the company. I got the job. I have only had to interview for a job since that time once, right? Every time I got a job, it was because somebody said, Ed, I want you for this. And that happens because you're in the industry, you've seen what the industry is doing, you know who the people are in the industry, and they actually know who you are. And as long as you're putting yourself out front so they can see you, you're going to get work. So yeah, the answer to your question is, it's not always about your abilities. In many cases, it's about your ability to be connected. And that's how I was able to get many of the jobs that I got.
Okay, another question. This one's a long one. Another techie period Motorola question. The MP1000 implemented a really crafty tiled object mode to allow high-res graphics. High-res graphics.
Yeah.
Yep, that was pretty unusual. Do you remember much about the design of that?
Yeah, I do. It was
very
the
cool way to the graphics.
Oh,
sorry, carry on. Sorry, go on.
Was that it? I'm sorry.
There's more. It's more comment than question. Seems like it was a very cool way to force the graphics chip to run in the high res, but with a minimal amount of RAM, and probably helped to keep the cost of the base console right down.
All of those things are absolutely true. And yes, it was Harry Cox who came up with that concept to manage the graphic mode in a way so that you can get the high resolution capabilities out of it at a low cost. Now, keep in mind, I was not the programmer, I was the hardware guy, but I do remember that. And people bring that up all the time. But yes, that's exactly what happened. And it was Harry Cox who came up with that concept. And by the way, Harry Cox is a Brit. I had not seen Harry Cox since I left APF. I wish I could. I've been trying to find him, but I was never able to. But he was the guy who did that work.
Not a name I've heard of, but
yeah.
Maybe someone will have. You never know. Any other questions from anybody? Nothing else?
Maybe one more. Is there anything you can tell us about the IM2 or also the PCOS? There's something.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay, wait. Okay, that's two different things, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the PCOS was something that was built before the video game was built and before the imagination machine was built. And the PCOS was an accounting computational system. PCOS was the name of the operating system, right? But yes, that was something that was sold back then. Didn't sell a lot of those either. It was a bread box machine, right? So that was the precursor to the imagination machine. Now, the imagination machine 2 was built at the time when the company was already losing money. So we got the unit built. We showed it at one of the consumer electronics shows. In fact, if you go to my website, imaginethat2.com, you'll see a nice picture of me in front of the Imagination Machine 2, smiling, beaming crazily, being so proud just to be there. I think I was 28 years old there at the time, showing that machine off. And the IM2, by the way, was a great machine. You couldn't see the video game. It had all of the capabilities of any other computer at the time. We added software for accounting, software for word processing, software for data analysis. We had a personal computer. We didn't have the marketing money to move it into the marketplace. And the company was folding at the time. They finally got it into the market. By the time they finally did, they were out of money and they closed the shop and it was gone. Now, there are still a few of those machines out there. The gentleman who I mentioned earlier, Benj Edwards, he has one. And I actually visited him about 10 years ago at his home in North Carolina. And he reshot that video of me standing in front of that IM2, the way it was configured back then, so that I had an updated picture of that. But yeah, that's the way it works. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, a couple more questions. What do you read, being one?
What do I read?
What do you read?
Cool. Oh, that's nice. All right. So I read a lot of mystery books. I'm a mystery buff, and a lot of technology books, but mostly a lot of mystery. I read things like Mickey Spillane is a mystery writer that I read a lot. I have read many books by John Keever, but that was years ago. I liked his readings. I'm trying to think, you know, you got me. Oh, I'm reading a series now that's an AI series. It's called Robots of the World. That's a good one. What else am I reading? You know what? I got to be honest. I am not reading as much right now because I'm writing. And I wrote the book that talked about my life, my career. And then I just published another book just the end of last year. And that book was based on the current environment around DEI. So I wrote a book, and I wanted to get the opinions from other folks who are African American in the technology industry to understand what they have been going through and what they are going through and what their needs are, and why it's important for them to know that they're not alone. Because when you're African American in technology and you're in these conferences, it's very hard to find another one looking like you. So the name of the book is called Specks of Pepper in a Sea of Salt. So that was just published last year. And this year, I decided to branch out, and I'm going to write my first novel. I've already started writing my first novel. Yeah.
Ooh, any plot spoilers?
Well, I can tell you the name of the novel is going to be called The Camden Chronicles. Now, Camden, New Jersey, is another one of those areas like Brooklyn. And I've had the experience there to see what goes on, to know some of the people there, and to know what, and the town is not that big, but big enough where you see a lot of different things happening. So this is going to be a detective story about murder, about drugs, about the environment, and about how some good comes out of it. That's the story.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question has come in. What conferences do you recommend?
It depends on where you want to go with your career, because there's so many conferences out there right now. It's kind of like, you really have to focus on saying, what is it that I want to do in my career? You probably know there's like a HIMSS conference for healthcare, right? There's a retail conference just for retail technology. When I started out, there was no conferences like this, right? There was CES, Consumer Electronics Show. That was it. And by the way, that's a great conference. So if you want to really just understand or get to see all of the new technology that's coming available, CES is the conference. But if you want to move yourself into the workforce in a big way, you want to pick one conference where you could say, this is an industry that I want to be an expert in. And again, that could be healthcare. So many different technologies right now in the healthcare industry. Same thing with retail, manufacturing. Robotics is big in manufacturing now. So if you want to be in that space in robotics, manufacturing is probably where you want to be. So it really depends on what you want to do in your career. Now, keep in mind that once I left once I left Apple and I started doing this technology stuff all across the board, that's probably the best that you can do. And if you want to do something like that, the best conference to go to is a conference like the Gartner conference, right? These analyst conference, because they look at everything and they're huge in that space. So again, if you want to be broad, you would go to an analyst conference. If you want to be specific, you pick that industry and you hit those conferences.
Right. Any other questions? I have one more because I can't resist. When you look back on your life so far, what are you most proud of?
Wow. That's a double-sided question, because it's if I look back on the way I've done personally, it's the fact that I'm still with my wife. I mean, I met her when I was 15 years old, and we're together now, and she's probably wondering why I'm still in here. But anyway, that's something I'm most proud of, my wife and my kids. But from a professional standpoint, I think the thing I'm most proud of, after finding out what I actually did without thinking about it, was the design of the MP1000 video game. That was the highlight of my career, and at the time I didn't even know it. So yeah, I'm very proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that people came out and started talking about it, that it was published and promoted, and at least now I can actually tell the story. The younger generation can hear the story, and they can see that now they can do this as well. So that's my legacy, I think.
And that's a great legacy.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think we'll end it there then. Thank you so much, Ed. That was a really fascinating talk, and thank you to everybody who's joined in as well. Great questions, everybody, and a nice event. So thank you very much, everybody. And Ed will be in touch with you to let you know about the recording and so on. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, take good care of yourself.
Take care.
Thank you very
Bye.
much, Ed. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.